Good afternoon. My name is Jim Hoagland. I write occasionally for the Washington Post. I just wanted to welcome you to this session. We haven't staged a coup d'etat. There's just no moderator for this. Nelson Cunningham and I want to offer you a few thoughts on the reaction in the United States to the horrible events in Paris last Friday, a week ago. And it almost goes without saying, of course, that the initial reactions and the enduring reaction by the American people, as well as the American government, reactions are ones of horror and revulsion at the barbaric savagery that was committed in the streets of Paris. We extend our sympathy to all those who were harmed in any way, and to those who, like many Americans, love Paris for what it is. Clearly, the killers hoped to change the nature of Paris with these terrible crimes. I'm confident they will not succeed. There are, of course, echoes for Americans of 9/11 in what has happened in Paris. It will change the way France looks at things and acts, just as it changed the ways the United States looked at the world and reacted. We all have to guard against overreacting, but the need for action has become very clear. At the same time, I have to point out that Americans, like other peoples, tend to fit what happens, what brings change, into their pre-existing beliefs and practices. And also, in this case, into their existing presidential campaign. So you will see a lot of things that would have been true before the killings, but now are only more so true. There is the thought, of course, in the United States that it could happen here. And that's why you're seeing interest paid to what does Belgium do? What does France do? Indeed, what does Europe do? How do the governments that have been attacked reestablish the trust of their populations? If you look at the front page of the New York Times this morning, for example, you'll see stories on what France is doing to try to increase surveillance and security. The same is true for Belgium. That's one of the essential issues that Europeans will now face, and that is, how can people feel safe again? In the context of our presidential campaign, these events are likely to inflame what is already a very serious debate over migration. It fans the flames of fear of the foreign that some candidates, and I would single out particularly Donald Trump on the Republican side, have used as issues for demagoguery. It also encourages more serious debate on questions like encryption of internet traffic, and erases some of the Snowden effect on the question of the balance of civil liberties versus those of national security. How safe are we, and how safe can we be? There will be some rebalancing. I tend to be a historical optimist, so I will look for some gleam here of good news. And there is the possibility that these events in Paris will make national security and foreign policy dominant issues in campaigns that until now have largely ignored those subjects. That this will become a serious debate. We saw in her speech yesterday the leading Democratic candidate for the nomination, Hillary Clinton, adopt a position somewhat much more advanced toward acting in the Middle East than President Obama has adopted. In her speech yesterday, she urged that the United States help establish a no-fly zone, and in other small ways, such as at least being open to the idea of increased special advisors from the United States, military advisors taking part in some future actions. She has edged herself away from the rather resolute positions taken by President Obama against significantly increased American action against ISIS and against other forces of evil in the Middle East region. But this is a highly emotional campaign. This is a highly emotional subject, of course. We are in the phase now of primaries. It's about 70 days away before the first primary is held. And this is at a time when campaigners of both parties reach out to their base. They want to be sure to solidify people who might vote for them, who might think as they do, who might think at least as they promise they will do. This will also change several key facts for France. In the United States today, in a way that they have not in some years, French politics matter, and French policy matters. The burden now is very much on France to take a good portion of the leadership in the battle against ISIS, the battle against jihadist terrorism, and in the civil war in Syria. I want to outline a couple of suggestions that will come back to my idea that we tend to fit new news into existing patterns and suggest now is the time, particularly for France, to change a couple of its key tenets. We have to recognize that Barack Obama is still president until January 20th, 2017. This is the president who has said, in I think the most telling sentences of his presidency, "I end wars, I don't start wars." This is a president whose national security advisor 2 years ago said, in essence, no region, no matter however important it is, can absorb all of America's energies and attention. She was speaking in the context of the Middle East, and it was a way of introducing what essentially has been an effort by the Obama administration to minimize, to every extent possible, American involvement in the Middle East. I think this is a moment in which France and all of the West could benefit from a change in what has been somewhat of a French attitude of taking distance from NATO. I think the French should take the lead in making these attacks a NATO matter for one particular reason, and that is fact that Turkey, a key player in whatever is going to happen, is a NATO member. And I think it's possible that with European Union leverage on Turkey at a very low point at this point, NATO could play a role in trying to get Turkey to play a more straight, a more clear, a more transparent, and quite frankly, a more honorable game in relationship to Syria. When Hillary Clinton talks about a no-fly zone, it seems to me that that can only make sense if there are troops to protect a safe haven, a buffer zone, as Turkey, in fact, has proposed but never followed through on. So I think it's a time to think about trying to get a NATO mission that will be able to convince Turkey that it has a great deal to lose by not cooperating and worrying less about the Kurds and worrying more about ISIS. France is also aligned with the Sunni powers of the region on the question of Syria. I have in mind Saudi Arabia, United Emirates, and as we've just heard, Qatar. France is also aligned much more with these countries on the Iranian nuclear deal than the United States certainly is. So I think France has some expertise, some influence, and some leverage that it can use. And this is true also in François Hollande's outreach to Russia. France lines up more clearly than the United States on a number of the questions that these events bring. It is time, perhaps, to bring a more constructive Russia into more serious conversations about what we do eventually about Syria, what we do about Bashar al-Assad, and seek help. General de Gaulle used to describe France as being equidistant between Washington and Moscow. Today, the United States is much more of the equidistance player, trying to work somewhat with Russia, but not too much. John Kerry is trying to bring Russia along in a more constructive way. While the question of Ukraine poses a major obstacle, I don't see a chance of lifting sanctions because of what's going on in Syria. But my point really is that Russia is essential, Iran is essential, the United States has to come to recognition of that, and France, through its very firm positions, can make that much clearer. I'm actually giving you an updated version of a plan that Jean-David Levitte presented at the World Policy Conference 2 or 3 years ago, and which I thought should have been endorsed immediately. That was in trying to, I guess it was 3 to 4 years ago, trying to work much more closely with Russia in seeking an end game. I'm just throwing these ideas out to get you to contribute some thoughts in the Q&A session and to flesh out or perhaps point out the problems with these ideas. Because at the end of the day, one of the wisest things Winston Churchill ever said was that Americans, after trying every other alternative, will eventually do the right thing. And we're in a situation today where that may tend to be true. I'm now going to turn the floor over to Nelson Cunningham, who is a principal of the McLarty Associates, a strategic advisory firm in Washington, and who can give you a much better picture of the domestic implications for the events in Paris than I can. I've tried to concentrate on foreign policy. McLarty and Associates is, as I say, a strategic advisory firm and very much emphasizes its bipartisan role. But Nelson has been part of kind of the Democratic wing of the association. He's worked for Joe Biden. He worked very hard on John Kerry's presidential campaign. He now serves on Secretary of State's Foreign Policy Board, and he is Vice President of the U.S. Business Council and is eager to give you his thoughts. Nelson?
Thank you. The wonderful thing about teaming with Jim Hoagland is that he can give you the reality. And now it's my turn to talk about the version of reality that we call politics. In America, the events in Paris have led to echoes of 9/11. Every American remembers the headlines in the French newspapers, "We're all Americans." And I hope that the French felt that same sense of solidarity this past week as every newspaper in the United States, in giant black letters, blared the shock and the horror of the events in France. There's another way, though, in which I think we're going to see now an echo of what happened after 9/11, which is that this is about to become a political football. Just as Paris and the French were reviled in freedom fries and for wine being poured down sewers on Capitol Hill, I think we're going to see in the months ahead Paris and Syria become one-word epithets hurled at each other across political voids in the midst of a very, very heated primary season. Let me tell you a little bit how I think that's going to play out. First of all, the horrific events in Paris and what's come since is going to accelerate the consolidation of the fields on both sides, Republican and Democratic. Let me spend a minute on the Democratic side, then I'll turn to the Republican. Clearly, when Hillary Clinton stood up, just the next day there was a Democratic debate, a week ago Saturday, And Hillary Clinton stood up and talked about, in her grave tones, deep knowledge about foreign policy. Many of us felt she hit that moment when Bernie Sanders, who was her leading opponent, said 2 sentences about Paris and then immediately lurched to, it's a rigged economy, it's against the little guy, it's for the big banks. Many people felt he didn't hit the mark. You can begin to see on the Democratic side, with the very serious speech that Secretary Clinton gave this week, a sense that Democrats are going to say we've absorbed the anger of Bernie Sanders, we appreciate the issues he's brought to the table of income inequality, but now it's time to consolidate behind our serious candidate, Secretary Clinton, and move forward. On the Republican side, it's much more chaotic. If on the Democratic side, the debate ranges between status quo plus and status quo plus plus, what Hillary Clinton came up with yesterday, on the Republican side, the debate is more like this. On the one end, bomb and invade. On the other end, really bomb and really invade. And it's that range that we've seen expressed. You've seen some of the angrier candidates, frankly, are some of the ones who are least knowledgeable on foreign affairs. Ben Carson and Donald Trump, who have both come not out of politics, but out of business and neuroscience. When they talk about these issues, they frankly lack credibility. Last Sunday morning, Ben Carson, Dr. Carson, was on a news show, and he was asked by the interviewer, now, which Arab leaders would you call first and in what order to put together the coalition? And he said, well, all of them. No, seriously, which ones first and which ones? He said, no, all of them. It was the same answer that Sarah Palin gave in 2008 when she was asked, what newspapers do you read? And because she couldn't really remember what newspapers she read, her answer was, well, all of them. Dr. Carson put an op-ed in the Washington Post on Tuesday trying to repair this and trying to come up with a serious approach. And his approach then was basically also, well, all of them. He said we should lead a coalition that would include Kurds and Syrians and Turks and Iraqis. And anyone who thinks that that's going to be an easy coalition to put together, particularly if you don't really know who the Kurds are, how they differ from the Turks, is going to be a little complicated. What we're going to see on the Republican side, I think, is a consolidation. I think the Republican base, though they are angry, though they are unhappy, will begin looking for candidates who they think can stand up to a very serious, deadly serious, and Hillary Clinton. I think that's going to mean that Ben Carson will fade. I think it's going to mean that Donald Trump will fade. Now, do I think that the anger in the base that motivates their support is going to fade? No. But I think it might repurpose toward a candidate that they find just as angry, just as anti-establishmentarian, but perhaps projects more seriousness and more intellect, and that's Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who, if any of you have seen, quickly runs to the right, quickly runs for the Republican base, but went to Princeton, went to Harvard Law School, clerked on the Supreme Court, and is actually one of the brightest people we've had running for president in a long time. I think that will then lead to another reaction, because if the angry vote goes to Ted Cruz, establishment Republicans will begin to panic. Ted Cruz is widely disliked in Washington because he's always gone his own way in the Senate. Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, may carefully craft a deal with the Democrats, and then Ted Cruz will stand up and say, no, I'm going to filibuster and spend the next 36 hours talking and blow up the deal. Doesn't care. Republicans don't like him. What are they going to do if they see him surging in the polls? They'll look for the anti-Cruz. Could it be Jeb Bush? Maybe. Although Jeb Bush has, although many of us, even on the Democratic side, like him, Jeb Bush has floundered in the polls. And even on this issue, he has floundered to get either his father's or his brother's seriousness of purpose on foreign affairs. I think it's more likely the candidate they'll go to is Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, also extremely articulate, very bright, younger generation, served on the Foreign Affairs Committee, can speak intelligently about foreign affairs. I happen to think he's dead wrong on most things, but he speaks intelligently on foreign affairs. And so I think at the end of the day, it could well be a Rubio-Cruz head-to-head in the Republican side. Now, what's ironic about this, people's criticism of Ted Cruz is that he is too far to the right, too harsh, doesn't want to work with people. The criticism of Marco Rubio is that he's young and he's inexperienced. Do you know who is exactly his age and has 2 years less in the Senate? Ted Cruz. They are both 44 years old. When Ted Cruz came to the US Senate, Marco Rubio had already been there 2 years. So we're going to have the least experienced pair, I think, facing off for the Republican primary election, if I'm right, in a head-to-head, which will be an establishment versus a disestablishment vote, anti-establishment vote. And on the Democratic side, we'll see a quick consolidation to Hillary Clinton. Now, where this is going to go from there is anybody's game. I can tell you that I worry very much that the time to make serious, nuanced policy is not during a presidential election or during a political campaign. I worry, as someone who's seen this happen before, that what may happen in the months to come is that very important decisions about America's alignments going forward, about America's alliance structures, about the way that America deals with Syrian refugees or immigrants, or deals with the French or deals with NATO, will be determined in the context of a very angry, very hard-fought political campaign. I guess that doesn't sound very comforting, and it is not. I think, Jim, what you and I would like to do now is turn it over to the audience, really try to get your questions. We'll go back and forth. Thierry, I know we started about half an hour late. I don't know if you want us to end at quarter of or to run through the full 45 minutes, but we'll look for your signal. And with that, let's turn it over to your questions, and Jim Hoagland will pick the first one.
Any questions? I think you've dazzled them, Nelson. You've gotten off scot-free. I see a hand here.
Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Kon from Thailand. Just listening to you both just now, I'm given the impression that what President Obama has to say about what America's strategy should be for the next year and a half is somewhat irrelevant. Is that really the case?
I didn't mean to imply that. If I did, not at all. In fact, I said that President Obama is still president until January 20th, 2017, and what he says is what will happen. The point I was trying to make was you can't expect much of an increased involvement in the war on ISIS from President Obama's administration. It's going to be up to the next president to make that decision, because President Obama, for good reasons and perhaps for some not so good reasons, is convinced that we have to flee from this burning building that is called the Middle East, that we are not going to put American troops in, and we're not going to put the kind of leadership that America has traditionally exercised on the world stage in trying to resolve the multiple conflicts in the Middle East. So he is very much in charge. He is very determined on some key issues, several of which we've outlined here. So he will still be calling the shots. He will be under increased political pressure, as we see now in the debate over immigration, where governors, Republican governors, have stood up and said, we don't want any refugees. And 47 Democrats voted with the Republicans in the House of Representatives this week to try to restrict immigration, which is actually a federal matter. And governors don't really have the power to say, we don't want any of the people coming in. They're too dangerous. When you consider the fact that Obama's talked about taking 10,000 refugees over a 2-year period, it's not a big risk that we're running, given the tight screening procedures that are already in effect. But this is going to be a very inflammatory issue, and he'll have to figure out ways to address the American people and to try to calm them down.
Jim, if I may, to keep this interesting, let me disagree modestly with some of what you said. I don't think that it's President Obama's vision that we need to flee this burning building. I think he's saying to the American people, do you have any idea how complicated this is? And he's saying to the Republican nominees or candidates, do you have any idea how complicated this is? Because I don't think you do. Do you realize that when you say, let's go after ISIS, do you know who's going to be right next door to us, right next to us? The Iranians. And Republicans, their heads snap back. They say, Iran? Well, they're terrorists. Well, no, but they actually hate ISIS even more than we do. So if we go after ISIS, we'll have the Iranians. You know who else we're going to have next to us when we go after ISIS? We're going to have Bashar al-Assad. Well, he's a dictator and a terrorist too. Well, but he hates ISIS as well. Do you know who we're not going to have on our side? And they'll go through the list. So I think that when President Obama puts forward a status quo plus, which is what I would describe his, it's because he thinks status quo has actually been pretty robust. He feels that the efforts of our special ops forces, that the bombing that's been done in Syria and Iraq, that the coalition that's been put together with many, many Sunni countries by our side, that the diplomatic efforts that Secretary Kerry has been leading in Vienna as elsewhere, I think he feels that that's actually pretty robust. And so when we go much further, we risk getting bogged down in a mistake, which the American people still remember well. They shorthanded as one word, Iraq. And the notion of sending a large collection of American troops there not only concerns many in the American people, but frankly concerns a number in our military who say, well, we couldn't figure out how to make this a sustainable peace last time. How can we make it a sustainable peace this time? So I would modestly disagree with you, Jim, and say that I think Obama is modest about what he believes the U.S. can do in the region, in part because history has shown that we have to be modest, at least in the current circumstance. That doesn't mean he's not committed to trying to find a sustainable framework. He thinks that arms are not the right way to lead on it.
I would just add that obviously President Obama wants to see an effective policy worked out. It's just that he has underestimated time and time again. And I think he has to bear some of the responsibility for that. You want to choose a questioner?
Yes. Actually, this gentleman over here.
Good afternoon, Vuk Jeremic from Serbia. Well, it sounds like both of you believe that it's very unlikely that beyond status quo plus, anything is doable with this administration for the next year and a half. But what happens if there's a continuation of the European crisis, actually exacerbation of the European crisis, and we see hundreds of thousands of more refugees, which Europe is not going to be able to cope with, coming to Europe, combined with another terrorist attack, for example. The French Prime Minister spoke about a possibility that more is coming our way. So basically, we have a terrible situation, and Europe actually asks, somehow Europe comes together and asks the United States to join together with the Russians. Is that conceivable at all, given the electoral cycle?
Absolutely, and it's part of my rationale in emphasizing the NATO dimension. It's interesting that you posed the question, because recent history shows that the reason that Bill Clinton got so heavily involved in the Balkans was primarily the argument that Richard Holbrooke made to him that the lack of American involvement was fraying the ties of NATO, that the European-American alliance was being weakened by the lack of American action. And I think if France takes a role now in trying to forge a broader NATO involvement, we could come to exactly that situation where President Obama is forced to look at the consequences of not intervening more robustly. Nelson?
Yeah, no, and I agree completely with that. And I think for President Obama, status quo plus doesn't mean walking away from the situation at all. It means what is the most effective way of destroying ISIS? There is no modesty in the goal of the United States, which is to degrade and destroy ISIS. I think what we're seeing now, but there's a sense that the United States cannot do it alone, and we can't do it with our troops, and certainly not with our troops in the lead. So the diplomatic effort that Secretary Kerry is undergoing right now to get the Russians and the Turks and the Saudis and the Europeans and the others, and the Iranians all at the table is deadly earnest, and I think it has every chance of success. I've seen Secretary Kerry assemble these coalitions and cut these political deals before. He did it in Afghanistan when they had that tied election a year and a half ago. He did it in Iraq when he had to get Maliki out and he had to cut the political deals to transition away from a Shia government there. He is masterful at this. And I think what we're going to see at the end of the day is a robust coalition effort that will destroy ISIS. It will have to find a way to put Assad to the side for the moment, put that issue to the side in a way that satisfies the Russians and the Iranians, while at the same time satisfying the Saudis and the Turks. We'll see how that works. But the goal will be not to let ISIS fester, but to work closely with the French on a strategy to destroy ISIS. Jim?
Sir. Microphone.
Je voudrais revenir, je vais parler en français si vous permettez.
Oh, c'est bien.
Bon. Je vais revenir à l'accord nucléaire avec l'Iran. Henry Kissinger, dans un article récent paru dans le Washington Post, il dit que d'aucuns voudraient comparer l'accord de Nixon avec la Chine à l'accord d'Obama avec l'Iran, dans la mesure où tous les deux visaient à réintégrer ces deux nations, leur donner une respectabilité et les rentrer dans le concert des nations. Il dit que la comparaison ne tient pas debout. D'une part, parce que depuis l'accord de Nixon avec la Chine, l'évolution des intérêts des deux parties était parallèle. Les deux parties avaient trouvé un intérêt dans cet accord et l'évolution des intérêts se faisait d'une manière naturelle. Et cela n'est pas le cas avec l'Iran, car l'Iran, c'est vrai qu'elle peut être réintégrée dans le concert des nations, mais dans la diplomatie iranienne, il y a un double jeu, dans la mesure où il y a des non-nations parties sur lesquelles il s'appuie dans les régions, en Irak, en Syrie, Hezbollah au Liban, les Houthis au Yémen. Donc on ne peut pas établir un parallèle. Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez?
Let me address it quickly. I think that's an excellent question. I spent an hour with President Rouhani when he was in New York during the UN General Assembly meetings. He had asked to meet with a group of American business leaders. Why did he spend an hour with us? Because he wanted to make the case that when the US was ready to engage with Iran commercially and economically, they would find a welcome in Iran. In other words, it was clearly part of his vision for the nuclear pact, that it's not just a nuclear pact, and it's not just looking for commercial engagement with Europe and the rest of the world, that if the US is not at the table engaging with Iran, he has not fulfilled his mission. I take from that really one important lesson, which is Rouhani is sincere, but the problem is he does not control the entirety of his government, only a part of it. He does not control the national security apparatus. He does not control the intelligence apparatus. He does not control the judiciary. So the risk for the United States is that unlike in sitting down with Mao, we're not getting 100% of the Chinese agreement. We're getting Rouhani, we're not necessarily getting all of the Iranian government. That is a substantial risk. The second, and you put your finger on another important point, within the US, on the Iranian deal when it was up before the Congress, every Republican voted against it. In fact, if it hadn't been carefully structured, it would have passed the Congress. It would have been rejected by the Congress, and the president would have been forced to bring it back into effect with a complicated parliamentary procedure. So the Republicans remain adamantly opposed to Iran and the Iran deal, and it's going to continue to be a fissure going forward. So that's a very excellent question.
I'm in the happy position of being able to say that I agree with the Washington Post. Nelson, you want to move us along?
Yes, this gentleman here in the front row, sir.
Thank you. I'm Miguel Moratinos, former Spanish foreign minister. We all were Americans on 9/11. We all were French last Friday. But the day after 9/11, some Europeans, majority of Europeans, were not Americans. And we didn't really support and understand the response of Bush administration. Well, some say that because he missed the target. The target was not Iraq or Saddam Hussein, it was some fanatic barbarians that are hitting us again. And they missed the target. And then, I think, modestly, he missed also the response. So today we have a different situation. We know what is the target, ISIS. And I think for once, we can all, as you say, NATO, without NATO, to create this international coalition. So we are much better prepared to really do the right job. And I hope that we will have a Security Council resolution very soon in order that even with the international legality, we can do the better job to get out of these fanatics. But my question is, even if we get out of ISIS, and we are going to do that, I'm sure we will succeed. You don't think we have to start to think about the real elements that create these kind of root causes in the Arab and Muslim world? Should we wait for the destruction of ISIS to take another attempt to make Israeli-Palestinian issue be solved? And my question, you think that even we are on time, that before the end of President Obama's term, even after a visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu, it seemed that they say, well, there will not be a deal between Israel and Palestinians during my mandate. Can we try to tell them that the time has come to make a final effort to bring peace between Israel and Palestine, and to be all together, Israeli, Palestinian, all Arabs, against these fanatics, barbarians?
I'm taking part in a panel discussion on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, so I'll reserve my comments for then. I'll just quickly come back to a point that I think your question raises, though, and that is, I think one of the lessons out of Iraq in particular, but many other conflicts, is that foreign intervention is doomed unless the neighbors of the country involved that's having the civil war really cooperate and really commit to a peaceful or at least a just solution. And that's one of the main reasons I put so much emphasis on Turkey. But I'll come back to your question, if I might, in another context. Nelson?
Very quickly. One, we did it right in the first Gulf War. We did it wrong in the second Gulf War. And the effort is to try to get it done right in this third conflict. And the last thing I'll say, and I'm told we're out of time, the last thing I'll say is this: I've known John Kerry a long time. He is not going to leave this job without another strong effort to lead to a Palestinian-Israeli accord. Just wait. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well done.